My parents kept every single report card my sister ever received, framed, displayed, celebrated. Mine were in a drawer. I found them by accident when I was 34 years old, helping clean out their house, still in the manila envelope from my elementary school, never opened. Tonight, every single story is about a parent who had a favorite child. 5 families, 5 patterns, finally seen clearly. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Melissa. I am 34 years old. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and 10 months ago, while helping my parents downsize into a smaller retirement home, I discovered a box in their attic containing every report card I had received throughout my entire elementary and middle school education, still sealed in the manila envelopes my schools had originally used to send them home, envelopes that had apparently never been opened by either of my parents across the entirety of my childhood academic career. My sister's name is Jennifer, and she is 37, 3 years older than me, and I want to describe the specific contrast this discovery revealed, because in that same attic, in a completely different, carefully organized box, I found every one of Jennifer's report cards from the same general period, each one removed from its original envelope, many with handwritten notes from our parents in the margins, several framed entirely, and all of them clearly having been read, discussed, and celebrated at the time they were actually received rather than simply stored away unopened for decades. I want to describe what it felt like to hold my own sealed elementary school report cards as an adult, opening them for what was apparently the first time in my life, discovering, as I read through years of my own childhood academic performance, that I had actually done reasonably well throughout school, consistent good grades and generally positive teacher comments that I had never known my parents had any awareness of, because they had apparently never actually opened these envelopes to find out. I want to describe the specific process of confronting my parents about this discovery, because it required considerable emotional preparation before I felt able to raise something this significant without simply becoming overwhelmed by the hurt it represented. I sat down with both of my parents together, bringing several of my own sealed report cards alongside several of Jennifer's opened, celebrated ones, laying them out for direct comparison, and asked them directly why they had apparently never opened a single one of my own academic records throughout my entire childhood while consistently celebrating Jennifer's during the same period. My mother's initial response centered on genuine confusion, suggesting she simply did not remember specifically not opening my report cards, an explanation that became increasingly difficult to sustain once I pointed out that every single envelope across multiple years remained completely sealed, a pattern too consistent to represent simple, random oversight rather than some kind of deliberate, if perhaps unconscious choice about where their attention and interest during my childhood was actually directed. My father, when pressed further, eventually offered what felt like a more honest, if still painful, explanation, suggesting that Jennifer had always been what he described as their more academically focused child, someone whose school performance felt genuinely important to track and celebrate, while my own childhood interests, which had leaned more toward athletics and creative pursuits rather than pure academics, had led them to simply assume my report cards would be less individually significant or worth the same level of attention. I want to describe what this explanation actually revealed, beyond its surface content, because it suggested my parents had made an early, largely unconscious decision about which of their 2 daughters' achievements actually mattered enough to warrant their genuine attention and celebration, a decision that had then perpetuated itself for years without either of them apparently ever questioning whether this pattern was fair or whether my own achievements, regardless of what specific domain they occurred in, deserved the same basic level of parental interest and acknowledgement that Jennifer's had consistently received throughout our shared childhood. Update: 4 months later. My parents have struggled considerably with fully processing this discovery, my mother in particular expressing what seems like genuine distress upon understanding, more completely than she previously had, just how consistently unequal their attention to Jennifer's versus my own achievements had actually been throughout our childhoods. We have had several difficult but ultimately productive conversations since this initial confrontation, conversations during which my mother has specifically apologized, in terms more direct and complete than I initially expected, acknowledging that whatever unconscious assumptions led to this pattern do not actually excuse the very real impact it had on how I understood my own worth and achievements throughout my formative years. Jennifer, once I shared this discovery with her directly, expressed her own genuine discomfort with learning about this specific disparity, telling me she had never fully understood, until seeing my sealed report cards laid out next to her own celebrated ones, just how differently our parents had actually related to each of us during a period she had simply always assumed had been relatively equal in terms of general parental attention and interest. I have kept several of my own report cards, now finally opened after all these years, in a small frame in my own home, a decision that felt, once I made it, like a small but meaningful way of finally giving myself the kind of acknowledgement and celebration that these particular achievements had never actually received at the time they originally occurred. Melissa's report cards sat sealed for over 2 decades, and just like Melissa found her parents' favoritism preserved in an attic box, the man in story 2 found his in something far more painful to discover. Not paperwork. A conversation he was never supposed to overhear. Between his parents. About him specifically. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what he heard. My name is Daniel. I am 31 years old. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and 9 months ago, while visiting my parents for a holiday gathering, I overheard a conversation between them, occurring in their kitchen while they believed I was still upstairs, in which they discussed, with what seemed like genuine unguarded honesty, their ongoing disappointment that I had not turned out more similarly to my younger brother in terms of career ambition and general life trajectory, a conversation that revealed feelings I had never previously suspected they held despite what I had always believed was a genuinely warm, supportive relationship with both of them throughout my adult life. My brother's name is Kevin, and he is 28, 3 years younger than me, and I want to describe the specific content of this overheard conversation, because it centered specifically on comparing our respective career paths, with my parents discussing what sounded like genuine pride regarding Kevin's recent promotion at his corporate job, followed immediately by comments expressing what they characterized as ongoing worry and disappointment about my own choice to pursue a career as a freelance graphic designer rather than what they apparently considered a more conventional, stable professional path similar to Kevin's. I want to describe what it felt like to stand frozen at the top of their staircase, listening to my own parents discuss, in terms far more direct and unguarded than they had ever expressed to me personally, their genuine disappointment about choices I had made regarding my own career and life direction, choices I had always believed, based on their consistently supportive comments made directly to me, they genuinely respected and celebrated rather than simply tolerating while privately wishing I had chosen differently. I want to describe the specific details that made this conversation particularly painful to overhear, because my mother specifically mentioned wishing I had, in her words, followed a path more like Kevin's rather than what she characterized as my more uncertain, financially unstable choice to build an independent creative career, comments that directly contradicted years of what I had understood as genuine, enthusiastic support she had expressed to me personally about my own professional choices and achievements. I want to describe the process of eventually confronting my parents about what I had overheard, a conversation I did not initiate immediately, needing considerable time to process both the hurt of what I had heard and how I actually wanted to address it, eventually deciding several weeks later that I needed to have an honest conversation with them directly rather than simply continuing to interact with them while privately carrying this new, painful understanding of their actual feelings about my life choices. When I finally raised what I had overheard, my parents' initial reaction was visible embarrassment and discomfort, acknowledging that yes, this conversation had occurred essentially as I described it, but attempting to contextualize it as simply reflecting normal parental worry about financial stability rather than representing any genuine, deeper disappointment in who I had actually become as a person. I pushed back directly on this characterization, explaining that regardless of how they wanted to frame it now, what I had actually heard was specific direct comparison between Kevin and me that consistently favored his choices over my own, language that felt considerably more significant than simple generalized parental worry about financial security. Update 4 months later. My parents have made what feels like genuine effort, in the months since this confrontation, to more consistently express direct support for my actual career choices rather than the kind of comparative language I overheard in their private conversation, though I continue to carry some underlying uncertainty about whether this represents a genuine shift in how they actually feel, or simply more careful management of what they choose to say directly to me versus what they might still privately believe or discuss between themselves. My relationship with Kevin, once I discussed this situation with him directly, revealed his own surprising discomfort with learning he had apparently been positioned, without his own awareness or consent, as the standard against which my own choices were being unfavorably measured, a role he told me he had never wanted or sought, expressing genuine solidarity with my hurt feelings rather than any sense that our parents' apparent preference for his chosen path reflected anything he had actively cultivated or encouraged. I have continued building my independent design career in the months since this discovery, finding, somewhat unexpectedly, that understanding my parents' actual private feelings, while genuinely painful, has also provided a kind of clarifying motivation to continue proving, primarily to myself rather than for their validation, that the less conventional path I chose represents a legitimate, valuable way of building a meaningful professional life regardless of whether it ever fully earns the same enthusiastic parental celebration that Kevin's more traditional career choices have apparently always received. Daniel heard the truth through a staircase he was never meant to be standing on. Our third story tonight is about a discovery that came through something far more official, a legal document that revealed a pattern, spanning not years, but decades. This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Patricia. I am 45 years old. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and 8 months ago, following my father's hospitalization for a cardiac event, I discovered that my parents had, for over 15 years, been consistently listing only my younger sister as their designated emergency contact and medical decision-making proxy across virtually every relevant legal and medical document, a discovery I made when hospital staff informed me, upon my arrival to see my father, that they were unable to discuss his condition with me directly because I was not listed as an authorized contact on any of his medical records, despite being his eldest daughter and someone who had always assumed, without ever actually verifying, that I held equal standing with my sister in these kinds of important family matters. My sister's name is Rachel, and she is 42, 3 years younger than me, and I want to describe the specific shock of this discovery, standing in a hospital waiting room being told I could not receive updates about my own father's condition because official paperwork apparently designated someone else entirely as the family's primary point of contact for exactly this kind of medical emergency. I want to describe what I did once I understood the actual scope of this situation, because my initial confusion about this single hospital-specific policy gradually expanded, once Rachel arrived and I discussed the situation with her directly, into understanding that this was not simply an isolated administrative error but rather reflected a consistent, long-standing pattern across multiple legal documents, including my parents' formal medical power of attorney designations, their will's executor appointments, and various other official capacities where family decision-making authority needed to be legally designated documents that, once I actually reviewed them carefully in the following weeks, consistently listed Rachel as either the sole or primary designated authority, with my own name either absent entirely or listed only as a secondary, backup option rather than holding equal standing to my sister's consistently primary designation. I want to describe the conversation I eventually had with my parents once my father had stabilized enough to discuss this situation directly, a conversation that revealed, through their gradually more complete explanation, that this pattern had apparently been established over 15 years earlier, around the time Rachel had moved back to our home city after several years living elsewhere, while I had remained living in a different state throughout this same period for my own career, a geographic distinction my parents apparently used to justify designating Rachel as their primary contact and decision-maker, reasoning that her physical proximity made her the more practical choice for these kinds of time-sensitive medical and legal matters. I want to describe why this explanation, while containing some logical practical elements, ultimately felt insufficient to fully explain or excuse the actual pattern involved, because rather than simply designating Rachel as a practical, geographically convenient primary contact while still including me as an equal secondary option genuinely consulted on significant decisions, the actual documentation had consistently positioned me as essentially peripheral to these important family decisions. For over 15 years, a choice that felt once fully understood like it reflected something considerably more significant than simple geographic practicality. Update 4 months later. My parents have formally updated all relevant legal documentation to reflect equal standing between Rachel and me as designated contacts and decision-makers, a process we completed together with their attorney shortly after my father's hospitalization resolved successfully. This formal correction, while practically meaningful, has not fully addressed the deeper hurt of understanding that I had apparently held secondary status in my own parents' formal planning for over 15 years without ever being told or consulted about this arrangement, learning about it only through the specific crisis of my father's medical emergency rather than through any direct conversation my parents had ever initiated about how they wanted to structure these important decisions. Rachel has expressed her own discomfort with learning about the actual scope of this long-standing arrangement, telling me she had generally understood herself as our parents' local, practical point of contact for day-to-day matters but had never realized this had formally extended into the kind of comprehensive legal primacy the actual documentation revealed, a revelation that has led to her own advocacy, alongside my direct requests, for the more equal arrangement we now have formally established. I continue processing what it means to have discovered this pattern only through crisis rather than through any proactive family conversation, a realization that has prompted broader discussions within our family about ensuring future important decisions and designations happen through direct, transparent conversation rather than the kind of quiet, unexplained 15-year pattern that only became visible to me through the specific circumstances of my father's medical emergency. Patricia discovered 15 years of exclusion through a hospital emergency. Our fourth story tonight is about a discovery that took even longer to fully surface, because it was hidden, not in one document, but in dozens of them, spanning an entire family business. Wait, let that sink in. Here is what happened. My name is Stephen. I am 39 years old. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and 7 months ago, while assisting my parents with what they described as routine business paperwork, I discovered that they had, over the preceding decade, been gradually and systematically transferring complete ownership of our family's manufacturing business to my younger brother through a series of incremental legal transactions, a process that had apparently begun when I moved to a different state for my own career approximately 11 years earlier and had continued, entirely without my knowledge, until my brother now held 100% formal ownership of a business I had always assumed, based on our parents' general comments over the years, would eventually be divided equally between the two of us as intended heirs. My brother's name is Mark and he is 36, and I want to describe the specific documents that revealed this pattern, a series of ownership transfer agreements spanning multiple years, each one transferring a modest additional percentage of business ownership from our parents to Mark, specifically transactions that, viewed individually, might have seemed like unremarkable gradual succession planning, but that, once I understood their complete cumulative effect, revealed that I had apparently been systematically and entirely excluded from any ownership stake in a business our family had built together over multiple generations, that I want to describe what it felt like to understand this pattern, Sitting with my parents' attorney reviewing paperwork I had initially believed simply required my signature for some minor administrative update. Gradually realizing, as the attorney explained the actual comprehensive history of these transactions, that this represented a complete, deliberate reorganization of business ownership that had occurred entirely without my knowledge or input across more than a decade, despite my own consistent understanding, based on conversations with my parents over the years, that I remained an equal future stakeholder in this business regardless of my own choice to build my primary career elsewhere. I want to describe the conversation I had with my parents once I fully understood what these documents actually represented. A conversation during which I asked them directly why they had never once mentioned this ongoing transfer process to me during the entire decade it had apparently been occurring, particularly given how consistently they had continued discussing the business with me during family visits and calls in ways that never once suggested any change to what I had understood as our shared future ownership arrangement. My father's eventual explanation centered on a belief that since I had chosen to build my career in a different field entirely, in a different state, my own genuine interest in eventually taking any active ownership role in the family business had become questionable enough that transferring complete ownership to Mark, who had remained actively involved in daily operations throughout this entire period, simply represented practical business succession planning rather than any deliberate exclusion of me specifically. I want to describe why this explanation, while containing some logical business reasoning, still felt profoundly hurtful once fully understood, because rather than having any direct conversation with me about whether I still wanted to maintain some ownership stake despite my different career path, or perhaps structuring some kind of arrangement that acknowledged both my own history with the family business and Mark's more active current involvement, my parents had simply quietly, over more than a decade, transferred everything to Mark alone without ever giving me the opportunity to advocate for my own continued interest or understanding in this significant family asset. Update 4 months later. Mark, once he understood the full scope of what I had discovered and how completely unaware I had remained throughout this entire decade-long process, expressed genuine discomfort with the situation, telling me he had generally understood our parents' transfers as simply formalizing his own increasing operational responsibility, rather than realizing the cumulative effect had resulted in my complete exclusion from any ownership whatsoever. Mark has, remarkably, proposed formally transferring a portion of his current ownership back to me, a generous offer that our respective attorneys are currently working through to structure appropriately, motivated, according to Mark's own explanation, by his genuine belief that our parents' original intentions likely never included my complete exclusion, but rather represented an unexamined pattern that simply continued without anyone actively questioning whether it still reflected what would actually be fair or appropriate given my own continued connection to our family and its business legacy. My relationship with my parents remains complicated as I continue processing how an entire decade of significant business decisions occurred without my knowledge, though I have found some measure of resolution in Mark's genuine, proactive effort to address this situation more fairly than our parents' original, unexplained pattern had ultimately produced. Stephen learned his brother had inherited everything, without either of them fully understanding why. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is about a discovery that took the longest of any story tonight to fully understand, because it happened not through documents or conversations or legal paperwork. It happened through a lifetime of birthdays, finally counted. This is the last story. Here is what happened. My name is Angela. I am 36 years old. I live in Jacksonville, Florida, and 6 months ago, prompted by a conversation with my own therapist about patterns I had never fully examined from my childhood, I spent several weeks going through old family photographs, receipts my mother had surprisingly kept in a filing system spanning decades, and my own childhood memories, calculating as precisely as available evidence allowed that my parents had spent approximately 3 times more on average on my younger sister's birthday celebrations than on my own across our entire shared childhood. A pattern I had never consciously quantified until this specific, deliberate examination revealed just how consistent and significant the actual disparity had been. My sister's name is Christina, and she is 33, and I want to describe the specific process of this calculation, because it required considerable effort to compile, going through boxes of old photographs looking for evidence of party decorations, gift wrapping, and general celebration scale, alongside my mother's surprisingly comprehensive filing system that included years of old receipts she had apparently kept for reasons unrelated to any conscious effort to document this specific pattern, but that nonetheless provided concrete, dated evidence of exactly what had been spent on various birthday celebrations throughout our childhood years. I want to describe what this evidence actually revealed once properly organized and compared, finding, across birthday after birthday spanning our entire childhood, a consistent pattern where Christina's celebrations included larger guest lists, more elaborate themed decorations, professional entertainment on several occasions including a hired magician, and for one particularly memorable birthday, a small petting zoo brought to our home, while my own birthdays, occurring during the same general childhood years, consistently featured smaller, simpler celebrations, often held at home with immediate family only, gifts that receipts confirmed were consistently smaller in total value, and no equivalent examples of the kind of elaborate entertainment or celebration scale that Christina's birthdays regularly included. I want to describe the process of confronting my parents with this compiled evidence, a conversation I approached carefully, presenting the actual documentation rather than simply relying on subjective memory that might have been more easily dismissed or minimized. My mother's initial reaction was genuine surprise at seeing the pattern laid out so concretely, though she attempted, initially, to explain the disparity through various individual circumstances, suggesting perhaps our family's financial situation had simply been different during certain specific years, an explanation that became difficult to sustain once I pointed out that the pattern remained remarkably consistent across multiple years and various different general family financial circumstances that I was able to independently verify through other records from the same periods. Update. 4 months later, my parents have struggled considerably with fully processing this discovery, my mother in particular expressing what seems like genuine, ongoing distress at understanding, through concrete documented evidence rather than simply my own subjective recollection, just how consistently unequal their celebration of Christina's versus my own birthdays had actually been throughout our childhood years. We have had several extended conversations since this initial confrontation, during which my mother has offered what feels like genuine, specific acknowledgement that this pattern reflected real inequality in how they approach celebrating each of their, rather than simply representing random yearly variation that happened to work out unevenly by coincidence. Christina, once I shared this documented pattern with her directly, expressed her own significant discomfort with learning about this specific disparity, telling me she had always simply assumed our childhood celebrations had been generally similar in scale, having no particular awareness at the time of how differently our parents had apparently approached planning and funding each of our respective birthday celebrations throughout the years we were actually growing up together in the same household. I have found this entire process of documentation and confrontation, while genuinely painful, ultimately validating in a way I had not fully anticipated, providing concrete evidence for a pattern I had always sensed but never previously had the specific documentation to fully prove, even to myself, until I finally undertook this deliberate, comprehensive examination of evidence spanning our entire shared childhood. That's all 5 stories tonight. If any of these hit close to home, let me know in the comments below. If you want more stories like this, every single day, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. A like helps YouTube show this to more people who might need to hear. Tonight, tomorrow's video has a story that might be the most shocking one yet, so make sure you're subscribed. Thank you for watching.